Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Maja Daoust. Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome, friends, to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we will continue our explorations of the cultures of consciousness. Today, we're going to talk about dreams and mysticism with Dr. Elliot Wolfson, one of the greatest living scholars on Jewish mysticism and matters beyond. And since we are talking about dreams, last night I sort of, as I went to sleep, I kind of willed to have some kind of incredible dream that I could share with you, but it didn't happen, or at least I didn't remember it. Maybe it did happen. But I am going to tell you a dream story, partly because, well, I have a captive audience here, for the most part, although, of course, you can hang up the phone, but so to speak. But it's short and sweet, and I think gets to the point. So I was having a typical anxiety dream, and I was in some kind of nasty, gray, post-industrial landscape, kind of like the beginning of Tarkovsky's Stalker film. So it's just sort of a gray, miserable, smog-ridden environment with a yellow sky, and I was very kind of anxious. And there were these people there, these figures that kept walking by, and I really wanted to have some kind of human connection. So I would approach them and talk to them, and every time I did, they would just yell at me or become kind of violent or threaten me, and it was just this horrible sense that there was no way to connect with people, and it was, unnerving and unpleasant. And then I kind of had this moment of lucidity, not like a full lucid dream, but I sort of woke up and I was like, wherever I am, I'm in this place where if I'm motivated by my fear and by my anxiety, every time I try to connect with anybody, it's just going to bounce back. So that's a hopeless task. I should just give that up right away, But then I'm still in this place because I'm not, totally in control of the dream or anything. And I'm like, well, so what am I going to do now? And I look around and and I start going, well, let me just check it out. Let's see what this place is like. So I look up into the sky, and it's this kind of yellow, smoggy, kind of nasty sky. And I'm staring at the clouds, and I go, wow, they're not actually made very well. It's a kind of a low bandwidth. I could kind of see the pixels. It was like a crappy AVI on or a YouTube video, and I was like, oh, this isn't really very well made. What is just as I realized that the whole construct of the dream was sort of a fabrication or sort of a poor video game, I shot through from this lame world into this incredibly vivid, bright, sort of psychedelically intense dream world. Very abstract, but very powerful and visually arresting. And in the middle of it, it was like I was confronting the dream machine. There was this sort of object that kept spitting off images after image after image after image incredibly rapidly, so much so I could barely even see what images were being produced. There was a pirate ship and a goddess, and I remember a tree and a moon or something like that. It was impossible to see because it was happening so incredibly quickly. Again, almost as if I had sort of stripped back the images of a typical dream world and was sort of like looking at the machine that was generating them. And then I woke up with this tremendous sense of exhilaration, one of those rare dreams where you pop up and go, wow, that was almost like an initiation. It's one of those things you remember, like great experiences in your life. And, I come to, thinking about this dream, I think about it off and on because it seems to suggest something very interesting about the dream world and the dreaming as a place of understanding as well as a place of experience and inspiration. And all of this was very much brought up by reading Dr. Wolfson's new book, A Dream Interpreted Within a Dream. And just to give you some background here, Dr. Wolfson is a professor at NYU. I think he's the Abraham Lieberman Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and as I mentioned, he's definitely one of the predominant, if somewhat controversial, scholars of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism these days, and most of his books are about, at least ostensibly, the Zohar and Kabbalistic mysticism and Hasids and all of this sort of very, very rich lore, which he is a master scholar of. But he's also interested in Buddhism, in contemporary philosophy and feminism, and brings these issues to bear in a really interesting way. And his latest book is definitely something of a departure, while it still includes a lot of mysticism. It also focuses very intensely on the dream, and I think will appeal to folks sort of outside of the mystical zone on this one. I do have to say, just as a sort of bit of warning, that his books are very challenging. They're philosophically dense. They're poetic. They go deep into the images, and at the same time, there's very, very rich scholarly material and meditations on the history and the texts of all of these various figures. So, but it's very, very worthwhile work, and I'm hoping that our conversation today will enable us to explore that a little bit more. And I want to make sure he wasn't on the line before. Are you there, Elliot?
I'm here.
Excellent.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that very kind introduction.
Nice. Well, I wanted to set it up a little bit to talk a bit about your background and how you got to the dream in the midst of all of your other work. But it was interesting to me to read in Jeffrey Kripal's book Roads of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom, which has a chapter on you, a little bit about your biography, and particularly that you went to yeshiva schools when you were younger, and you were sort of very much came up within the tradition intellectually. And I'm kind of curious about how you moved away from it. What sort of pulled you into your own unique path, while at the same time staying with the larger framework of these texts and traditions?
Okay. I usually think of my in response to that question of Kafka's famous parable Before the Law, where the man from the country comes to realize that he's inside by being outside. So in some respects, even though I'm outside of the tradition in which I grew up, that's my way of being inside it. It was, it's a long process of separating from my upbringing, but I think the critical moment came when I started to study philosophy in college and started to broaden my perspective and look at other traditions, other religious traditions, but there was an undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the Orthodox world that I grew up in, and that was already evident in my adolescence. But it took a while before I finally left Orthodoxy.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories that Kripal tells that is has that sort of scholarly drama to it is this moment where you as you're going towards your graduate studies, you can't really decide about whether you're going to study Jewish mysticism or follow the Buddhistic or Eastern paths that obviously are deeply inform your work and are clearly very central to you. And then you had this kind of moment of decision, which is one of those interesting sort of moments, I think. And I'd love to hear why you chose what you did.
Yeah, well, Jeff recounts it in a very beautiful way, and it quite literally was a walk that I took, because at the time I was studying at Johns Hopkins, and I had in my left hand acceptance to go study Asian religions University of Santa Barbara, and in my right hand, my acceptance to go to Brandeis to study Jewish philosophy and mysticism. And at the end of the walk, I decided to put in the mailbox the envelope in my right hand. And I wonder about that decision, actually. It is the road not taken. But at the time, I just felt that to study a religion, one has a definite advantage if one knows the textures and the rhythms of that religion from deep within oneself. And I had that. So even though at the time I had already stopped being Orthodox, I felt that I was so ingrained with those rhythms that they would serve me well in my further exploration of the mystical dimensions in Judaism. And I think that proved to be correct.
Yeah, but at the same time, like you say, you are in some ways an outsider, or maybe perceived that way to some degree.
Oh yeah, I mean, the book before the Dream Book was this book on Menachem Mendel Schneerson, a Hasidic master from the Lubavitch community, and that's the one that, because of the nature of the subject, it drew the most comments from outside the academic world, and over again, people refer to me as an outsider, and sometimes to discredit my work, but that's to be expected.
Well, it raises an interesting point about who gets to speak for things and who gets to adjudicate who has that ability.
And the line between inside and outside is so fluid. At every stage, it's artificially refashioned, because there is no such thing as a pure inside. So the whole discourse needs to be re-examined and moved beyond a kind of binary distinction between inside and outside.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I learned from your work and others, but probably more strikingly in your work, because you're so aware of that insider outsider line, and in some sense of you live it as well as think about it, that when you bring some of the tools of scholarship to bear on mysticism, and including history, psychology, particularly philosophy, that what you see is that there's always these kinds of transformations. There's always critical readings. There are always misreadings, creative misreadings, some more interesting than others.
Right.
And so it becomes, then you start to see that the desire for there to be a tradition with a capital T is in a way something we do, not something that's out there.
Right. I couldn't agree more.
So, I would love to give just a little taste of the first book of yours that I read was your first. I think it was your first major book, or your first book, Through a Speculum That Shines.
Uh-huh.
And just the figure of the speculum there. I know it's an immense book with many different dimensions and characters, but I think there's something about that difference between the speculum that shines and the speculum that doesn't shine that helps set up some of the ways that you talk about the dream, and so we can get into your more recent stuff there. But I would love it if you could essay a brief synopsis there.
Right. Well, there's no question that there is an arc or a trajectory from the speculum to the dream interpreted within the dream, and that thread is the exploration of the imagination, and that's really the term speculum there is being used to refer to the imagination. It's most specifically derived from a Talmudic passage which distinguishes the prophecy of Moses from that of all other prophets, that Moses saw through a speculum that shines or a translucent mirror, whereas the other prophets saw through a speculum that doesn't shine or an opaque mirror. But for me, it signifies the imagination. So I've been on that journey for a long time.
Well, I'd love to push on this idea of the imagination a little bit before the dream, I know that it's, for me, one of the most central ideas that I keep coming back to, because, you know, in contemporary usage, we tend to have a very sort of thin idea of what the imagination is. It's the place where you make mistakes, or maybe artists or certain kinds of artists have a really good one, and that means you know, you can see it in their work. But when you, again, go back into history and you start really in poetry and really start getting a deeper sense of how mystics and religious thinkers, you know, really felt their way through the texts and their rituals and their experiences, the imagination becomes really much more significant. And it's almost like I think the idea that we don't really quite recognize is that it's a faculty. It's right. It's like memory or hearing. It's a zone of a fundamental aspect of our consciousness that has very specific things that it does, particularly in a religious or mystical framework. So how would you kind of characterize that more robust sense of the imagination?
Well, you know, it reaches a very explicit articulation by the Romantics, who singled out the imagination as the most distinctive feature of what it is to be human, but it actually has a much, much older history, and it's very, very pronounced in the mystical traditions. My exploration goes most deeply into the Jewish mystical texts, but there are clearly parallels in other traditions, and it's precisely what you said. It's sort of the faculty by which the human being is the most human and can achieve a kind of self-transcendence. And specifically in terms of the Jewish mystical tradition, and here I see a very strong parallel with Islamic mysticism, Sufism, it's the organ of the heart, or the eye of the heart, by which one can envision that which is invisible, or one can imagine the unimaginable. But, you know, it's a very paradoxical notion, because it involves, as I've tried to articulate, this very subtle relationship between concealment and disclosure. What does it mean to see that which can't be seen? What does one actually see when one is seeing that which can't be seen?
Yeah, one of the senses I've kind of, you know, played with is that it's in modern kind of technological terms, we can talk about it as an interface. You know, we sit there with these computers, and on the far end of the computer, there's a bunch of you know, little jolts of light, you know, zapping through this immense circuit through a bunch of on and off gates. That's what the computer is doing. And then there are these layers up. Machine language is a sort of very complex and hairy way to sort of control those bits. And then we build up these layers until we get to ordinary programming languages, and ultimately the screen. You know, and of course our screens they have moving things, they have trash cans, they have magic documents that appear and disappear, and it's this whole sort of concocted world. And you know, you call the interface, and people have to work on the, you know, who are designing new programs. They don't just design you know, the nuts and bolts, so to speak. They also have to design the surface that we engage with. And in a way, the imagination is like the cosmic or mystical form of that interface, where it's not what's necessarily really going on, and yet at the same time, you can't get there without it.
Well, it may be, it's the virtual reality, but the virtual may be more real than what we consider to be real.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so,
okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, it seems like a way to move into the specific category of dream, which you must be, you know, you haven't been thinking about quite a lot for a spell here. And in the course of your work, I mean, you wrote a number of really heavy-duty scholarly books, and then you did this book on Schneerson, which was definitely more, you know, as you say, it was going to be read by a broader audience, and it had a more contemporary kind of topic, even though it was still inside the stream of Jewish mysticism. And then for this book, you came to write about the dream. And yes, of course, you're drawing from your immense lore on Kabbalah and Hasidism and such, but you clearly it's also a move into a different zone. So
right.
What was it about the dream that called you at this point in your writing career?
Well, again, I think that it's something that it's a path that I've been on for a long time, and I also write poetry, and the dream imagery is very salient in many of my poems. But I actually thought about writing this book before I did the Schneerson book, and I felt like I came to a point academically and intellectually that I wanted to move beyond the specificity of a scholar of Jewish mysticism. But I began the work on this book in earnest the semester I was at Rice, which was the fall of 2007. But then when I came back, I put it aside and I wrote the other book. So in some ways it's a departure, but in other ways it's not a departure, because it's again an exploration for me of the imagination, but specifically how it connects to the invisible, which for me doesn't name a thing or even an event, but it's sort of the criterion of what I call non-phenomenalizability. That is the condition that makes all things phenomenal appear, or the way I refer to it in the dream book, the unseeing that enframes every act of seeing. So in some sense, what this book is a phenomenology of the inapparent, which is a term that Heidegger used at a certain point to refer to his own work, and that's a whole other dimension of my intellectual life. My close reading of Heidegger and the indebtedness my work or my thinking shows in relationship to his thinking. So, yeah.
It's also the place where you touch on a lot of Buddhism. I mean, I'm much more familiar with Buddhist and to some degree, Hindu or Vedantist ideas. And one of the wonderful things about your writing for me is that sometimes you explicitly address Buddhism. In the current book, you have wonderful passages on Dogen and Shankara and other materials. But even beside that, it's actually when you're talking about other things, I can sort of feel the ambience. I can recognize the sort of the tang of the incense, so to speak. and so that seems to me it's a very rich place to approach that non-seeing that structures or allows or is the condition for our seeing. Because in a lot of ways, I think that if that sounds that can sound kind of abstract or sort of gobbledygookish to people who aren't reading Heidegger and reading phenomenology. I think that often particularly through some Buddhist practice and Zen practice in particular, there's really a sense of moving into that space in a very resonant way, where simultaneously it's about what you're seeing, what's happening, but it's also what allows that to happen, and it's always sort of elusive, or it's at one step removed, or it's tangential.
Right, and it's the Tibetan practice of lucid dreaming is all about being able to mark that and then erase the line between waking consciousness and dream. And that's the key to enlightenment ultimately, when we realize that that's a very thin line. When we wake from the dream that we're dreaming. That's the moment of enlightenment. And I was amazed to find articulations of that in the Jewish mystical sources. That was a surprise to me. These were texts that I had studied for a long time, but I I didn't pay attention to that dimension, and it was very exciting to me to find it in these sources. Particularly interesting in a 13th century source written by Moses de Leon, who's at one point was thought to be the author of the Zohar, is now thought to be a leading Spanish Kabbalist who was involved in the Zohar. But in one of his Hebrew mystical texts, he recounts a story where this wisdom is gained from the East. So it's very interesting. I mean, you have already embedded in that text the justification for a comparative mysticism.
That's amazing. That must have been a very pleasant surprise.
It was it was, and it was very confirming because, believe it or not, I have been attacked by some people for muddying the waters, bringing Buddhism in to explicate things in Jewish mysticism.
Yeah, well, since I have been, kicking around the academic halls a little bit more than the previous 20 years of my life, I was sort of one of the things that I learned, was exposed to, was how difficult it is to, sort of justify, that's not quite the right word, but to frame comparativism in a rich and robust way, to say, yeah, there are these connections between different traditions, and they may not be simple, and it may not be as simple as they're all pointing at the same thing,
right,
which is, an idea that people had throughout the 20th century, and indeed a lot of, more popular readers who read, 20th century books about religion and mysticism often encounter this idea,
right,
this perennialist idea.
Right.
And in the wake of that, it's like you can't do it at all. And it's like they're going to jump down your pants if you even sort of quote something that resonates. And that really kind of blew my mind. So
right,
if you can help me understand how we can come back to a more robust way of comparing, such as you already do, but there's a lot at stake there.
Yes. Well, I think the key is that one can't obscure the particularity or specificity of any path. One has to go deep into these different paths. We wouldn't want to face all the traditions in some kind of perennialism or commonality. I mean, we want each of the traditions to be preserved in its cultural and linguistic particularity. But by going deep into any one tradition, I really do believe one finds the roots out of that tradition. So that's a tricky balance, and there are a number of scholars presently who are operating on that spectrum. And I listened to the interview you had with Yoni Garb back in September, I believe, and yeah. I know the issue came up in your conversation with him, and I thought he gave a very beautiful articulation of the point as well. So we don't need to bifurcate essentialism versus contextualism. The truth is somewhere in that middle, where both are equally true because both are equally false.
Exactly, and in a way, that's where the imagination steps in, or arguably the dream again, where
right.
If the imagination is an interface between us and our kind of conventional or space-time organization of everyday reality, including the dream, and the unmarked beyond, then that interface, of course, is going to take local forms. It's going to reflect our own peculiar historical experiences, our own
exactly.
technologies, our own very historically conditioned ways of being. But the interface itself and the dynamics of it and the slipperiness of that confrontation
right.
are both shared and therefore not shared, and
right.
so it's a very rich place that your work has helped me
right.
help me understand.
In the book, I refer to the dreams having a mytho-logic of their own, and in that term mytho-logic, it brings together the term myth and logic, and for me, again, those are not in opposition to one another. But one of the critical features of that mytho-logic is this concurrence of contradictory or incongruent images, and leading to what I call a calculus of the non-calculable, or embracing the paradox that opposites are the same in virtue of being opposite. And perhaps this is most poignantly expressed by the realization that within the dreamscape we can't distinguish truth from fiction. What it is to be true within a dream is to be false. And again, that seems to me have far-reaching implications, and then again gets us back to what I think is the insight in the Buddhist tradition. When you can break down the distinction between what you consider to be truth and non-truth, that's that moment of true enlightenment.
Yeah, and that idea was there's one chapter in particular. I mean, I was thinking of potentially struggling readers, and I think that the chapter that I would encourage people to go to in a way first is the chapter on coincidentia oppositorum, because people are familiar with that idea from Jung. It's an idea that people come across this combination of opposites, but I had never made the connection really until I read through your chapter about how the incongruous mixtures that we experience in dreams and other kinds of trance states as well, where there's odd things that combine in different spaces and times and creatures that it's not, we often think of that as like, well, that's sort of the fantasy realm or the dream realm, and that's on like a kind of a lower spiritual level. And then you have to climb all these levels where things become more pure and more refined and more, impersonal or empty. And then there's some kind of, enlightenment moment. And really from your work, you're like, well, yeah, maybe, but it's just as much the case that in its very mixture of incongruous elements, its juxtapositions, that whole language of contradiction, that it in sense is directly expressing in some way or connecting with the highest high, where right. Of course all opposites coincide in these complex ways.
Right, exactly. And to translate it into the Kabbalistic idiom, that's the way to infinity. The dream is the ladder to get to that highest point where the opposites coincide. But the full paradox is that their opposites are the same in virtue of being different, and that actually has implications for what we were talking about before, because the true insight recognizes the convergence of the opposites, but still is able to preserve their difference. Right.
Excellent. Yeah. So then that reflects also on the whole operation of comparing different traditions and trying to find our way between right. their connections and their divergences. Well, this is a great conversation. We have to take a break right now.
Okay.
It's Erik Davis. We're talking with Dr. Elliot Wolfson on expanding mind, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Expanding Mind. I'm Erik Davis, and we're talking with Dr. Elliot Wolfson about his new book, A Dream Interpreted Within a Dream. Another chapter that I was that kind of blew my mind was a letter overwritten, where you talk about this idea that seems really well established in the Jewish tradition about the relationship between dreams, having dreams, which of course people were very, and still are very interested in as, foreshadows of the future or its potential as oracular sources, but the relationship between the dreams and their interpretation, and particularly the idea that there are multiple interpretations, and that's sort of part of the openness of reality itself. And it's a very tricky but very wonderful idea that I'd love to hear you explain a bit.
Well, of course, that's the title itself, A Dream Interpreted Within a Dream, is based on a Talmudic passage which is part of this larger view that you just expressed, namely that the dream is a text. There's another famous Talmudic passage: a dream that goes uninterpreted is like an epistle or a letter that hasn't been read. And so this idea of the textual nature of dream does go very deep in the Jewish mindset. And as you also correctly noted, the multivocality of interpretation is something also that is very, very central to the rabbinic and then later Kabbalistic thinking, so that any text has multiple interpretations. There is a rabbinic formulation that kind of puts a limit on it. Each word has 70 aspects, has 70 potential interpretations, but obviously the number 70 for them represented a totality. So it means that there are numerous ways to interpret any text, and the same can be said for the dream. But it is a far-reaching idea, and goes to the heart of the way they viewed the nature of reality as textual. And then in the Kabbalistic material and then in the Hasidic material, this becomes very concretized, because there is the belief that the very materiality of the world is made up of the Hebrew letters. And so the idea that the world is a text is taken quite literally.
Yes, and here I can't help but in a spirit of a sort of wayward comparativism, which you also hazard at a few points in your book that I really admire as well, is when you hear ideas like this, it's almost hard to not start thinking about biology, to not think about physics.
Right.
And, of course, it's so easy to make mistakes there and to say fatuous things, and et cetera, et cetera. And yet, it also seems really important to not just say, oh, these are cultural ideas. They have to do maybe with human consciousness, maybe with literary culture, but they don't really have to do with, like, the actual world we live in or the discourses of science and things like that. But it seems like there are certain ways to do that in a subtle way that is rich. And you do talk about quantum physics at some point. So
right.
when you start to think about how these things can sort of weave together or illuminate one another, how do you think about that, given the sort of challenges of bringing in such different languages?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult book from that perspective, and in that sense, it's sort of emulating a dream, and the narrative with which you began. Recounting your dream, where you have these images shooting at you. So in a way, that's what's going on in this book. There are all these disparate paths that are being opened up. Are they held together in any one way? That's an interesting question. I began the book by saying that, in my view, the dream persists as one of the most enduring and effective ways to defend against the ubiquity of a materialistic bias that has dominated psychophysiology and neuroscience. And I relied on Foucault, who argued that the dream is, in his exact words, an anthropological index of transcendence. And I think that is the thread that ties together all the different and disparate paths. And by transcendence, for me, the dream is an experience of transcendence under the sign of the imaginary. But by transcendence, I don't mean something in a supernatural sense. I don't think that there's any justification to flee from the natural world. So transcendence for me is the enigma, the paradox that's within the metaphysical within the physical. And that's why I call the first the introduction transcending transcendence and the specter of invisibility. So the dream is paradoxically the maximum of our imaginality that brings us beyond the imagination to the invisible. But again, the invisible for me is not something out there, something or event, but it's at the core of everything we can experience in the phenomenal world.
One of the things I love about that approach, almost from a kind of dream practice or dream yoga perspective, not in the strictly Tibetan sense, but just in terms of how people experience their dreams, is a lot of people who get into dreams for either from the imagination or for psychospiritual reasons. There's often this great focus on like what is seen in the dream or what is heard in the dream or the messages from the dream or the content, we might say, again, right. Kind of technological language or modern language. But what I kind of got, from your book and the stuff that I've been thinking about in general, and in some sense that dream story I told at the beginning is part of this feeling that there's just as much that the dream tells us through what is not seen, through how it breaks down, through the gaps that surround it. I mean, you right. think again to think about the Tibetans, is that the whole idea of the bardo isn't just this in-between space that we visit upon death, but it actually, there's many bardos throughout our life, and in some sense, the best example of the bardo, of these passages that we move through that are both real and not real, is the experience of going in and out of dream, of awakening from right. The dream, of that moment when you're like still in your dream thoughts, and then there's like no, I'm on my bed, and there's a gap there. There's this remarkable place that seems to me to be as much about the teaching of the dream as any particular image or encounter or figure or anima image or whatever that might be in the dream.
Right. That makes sense to me. Also, we haven't talked about the notion of a dreamer, which is another thing that comes up in several places in the book, where I kind of deconstruct the self of the dream, and that, of course, that would be my biggest problem with a Freudian approach. It's not a self having the dream, because the self within the dreamscape, we come to realize that the self is constructed by the very dream. The dreamer is constructed by the dream, as much as the dream is constructed by the dreamer. So there's a kind of circularity there, which breaks down that sense of an autonomous self. I don't know if that was very, very clear.
No, it's very, and that's another way in which we can use, people who are interested in dreaming as a practice. It's another kind of avenue. Again, not being, there's a kind of way in which we reproduce our normal grasping mindset towards the dream. Right. It's like, it's another place to have an experience. And, and if you listen to people, some of the people who are into lucid dreaming, they're very, acquisitive about it. It's like, you can do whatever you want. You can, go to the other planets, and you can, have all these pleasures. And you're like, yeah, I think you're missing something here. I think there's a little, an opportunity that perhaps is being wasted. My wife I'm not a particularly great dreamer in terms of remembering things and having very much experience, but my wife is one of these people. She wakes up every day with, many journeys and stories, and very rich ones. But she talks about dream subjectivity, and one of the things she points out that's very interesting is that there's a dreaming self that she has that's continuous, or that was more or less continuous, where it's like, I'm in the dream again, and then suddenly you have access to a whole set of memories and associations and skills that are only really true in that world, but it's not just for that particular dream. There's kind of a continuity between these dream selves, almost as if they are sending messages to one another without you picking it up until you're, some version of you are there again. So that move towards the towards the self in dreams seems
right. But an expansive self, a more relational or notion of self, rather than an atomistic, which isn't to deny that all of what we are comes to bear on our dreams. I mean, you mentioned before memory, but there's a very, very close connection between memory and imagination, and this goes back to the ancient Greeks. So that's for, in some sense, in terms of the history of Western philosophy, imagination has been the other, because reason reigns, and the imagination is problematic, in terms of discerning truth or even setting one on the right path ethically. But the imagination has always been there as philosophy's other, and there's been a recognition that, at least from Aristotle forward, that you couldn't have knowledge without the imagination, because you couldn't have memory without the imagination. So I don't mean to suggest that there's the dissolution of self means the particularity of any individual is irrelevant. But what I'm getting at is, some greater notion of self or even non-self in the Buddhist tradition.
We got about 8 minutes left here, and there's a final thing I'd love to throw in this already very broad mix about prophecy and time. And I thought one way of doing that is just to have you reflect on a psalm that comes up a few times in the book, 126:1. When the Lord restores the fortunes of Zion, we will be as dreamers.
Right. Right. It comes up in a number of places. Well, it's clearly, in its literal sense, it's an apocalyptic or messianic passage, restoration to Zion. But it read Kabbalistically, it's not so much the geopolitical restoration, but it's attaining this higher state of meta-consciousness, reaching the place that is the ultimate source of the dream, which is the place where the opposites coincide. So it's a spiritualization of the motif, of the messianic motif.
And you talk a lot about that sense of exile, which is, one of those notions or experiences or existential states that is very particularly associated with Jewish tradition. I mean, there's some things where we're going to find commonality, and there's some places where people are where there's a really specificity there.
Right.
And there's some interesting thinking about how we understand our experience in this world, with its mixtures, with its confusions, with these paradoxical openings, with the continued existence of all of the difficulties and evils in ordinary life. That there's something about that metaphor of exile on a spiritual level that's clearly important to you, and it's important to the tradition.
Right.
And
well, there's again the literal sense of exile, vis-a-vis the land of Israel, but then there's also a much more spiritual sense of exile. In a way, all of the world becomes diasporic or exilic, and so even if one is in Jerusalem, doesn't matter, one is still experiencing exile. And the dream affords one the possibility to be redeemed from exile, but not by retreating to some kind of city of God or some heavenly space, but realizing the transcendence within immanence. And also in terms of time, it's very interesting, because the sense of what I call the undoing of time, where there's a collapse of the distinction between past, present, and future. yielding to this sense of time as the possibility, the open-ended possibility, or indeterminacy. And the dream bespeaks that as well, and that's again very different than the Freudian approach to the dream, where you're constantly struggling with the past. This puts the focus in a different way.
And one of the elements of that openness of the future, of the kind of productive possibilities of the moment, has to do with those multiple interpretations. That just as there's many ways to read a text, there are many ways to read a dream, but there's even a sense, even in the tradition, that reading dreams, different kinds of readings of dreams can be true in different ways.
Right.
And that's a sign of that openness.
Right, and there's no one interpretation that's necessarily the correct one. Or today's interpretation might be correct for today. Tomorrow may yield a different story.
Does that openness ever give you sort of a kind of vertigo?
Yeah, it can. Yes. One has to be strong to sustain that degree of openness. And it's sometimes much easier for us to close things a bit. Closure, brings some kind of security and safety. But this is about reaching to the infinite. So it's wide open.
Oh, that's a great place to wrap it up. We have just a couple minutes left here. I wanted to give you the opportunity to let people know. Is there anywhere online that collects some of your articles, or that people can find out more about you?
There is a website. I don't remember it right now, but if one puts my name into a search engine, it'll come up, and a number of my articles are there, and also some images of my paintings and some of my poems. So one could get a sense of the three different realms in which I work. Great.
Are you going to have some more poetry coming out?
I haven't thought about that right now, but maybe.
Do you have a current project?
Yeah, I'm working now on another book, and thinking about a book beyond the one I'm now working on. But the one I'm working on now is on the notion of the gift, which I touch upon in the dream book. But I want to get beyond the language of the gift to a sense of giving, which doesn't presume an agency of a gifter.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up there.
Okay.
Elliot, thanks so much for being on the show. It was really fun.
Well, thank you very much, Erik, for having me.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Bye. From Erik Davis to all of you, keep your minds open.